Hello, fellow rebel capitalists. Hope you're well. First story in the news today. British supermarkets are actually starting to ration fruits and vegetables.
We've been to a couple of different supermarkets today, and there are a lot of empty shelves.
And it may get worse before it gets better.
But there are bigger questions as to what's behind these supply issues.
So what is causing these shortages? Something you'd usually see in third world countries. Well, there's several reasons, but one of the main reasons are the sanctions against Russia. And this is something we've been talking about on this channel really since the war started. And you can see my Twitter feed on this and several tweets. And in fact, I actually had to turn off my DMs back when Putin invaded Ukraine because I was literally getting death threats because my position was we shouldn't sanction Russia. Why? Is it because I love Putin? No, absolutely not. It's because I knew doing a simple cost-benefit analysis that the costs would far outweigh the benefits in terms of Europe versus Russia. And it's just very, very simple common sense. So Russia produces a lot of the energy that goes to Europe. We all know that now. But what does Europe provide Russia? Well, basically dollar bills or currency units. Okay, well, they can get those currency units from India or China by selling their oil to other countries. So on net balance, Russia isn't really impacted that much, or at least they're not impacted to the degree to which Europe, and I would argue the United States, is impacted.
May have to start, taking public transportation at this point because it's getting to a point where it's impacting me being able to make my monthly bills.
And I always use the example of going in as an amateur boxer, someone who's never even been in the ring, and you're in there with, let's say, a young Mike Tyson. Okay, well, the first thing you don't want to do is punch yourself in the face. And that's exactly what Europe did with all these hardcore sanctions towards Russia. They did this based on emotion. This was a knee-jerk reaction. And again, what's amazing is the people who are actually standing up and stating the obvious were actually getting death threats on social media. So let's dive into some of the details and get into an article straight from CNBC. The title, British Supermarkets Are Rationing Fruits and Vegetables as Shortages Bite. I want to point out some of the key talking points here. Supermarkets are limiting purchases of tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, lettuce, as supply shortages lead to empty shelves. And again, this is in the UK. This isn't in Ethiopia. Second talking point here. British farmers are struggling with high energy costs, reducing their ability to grow certain fruits and vegetables under heat. So in the winter in the UK, if you haven't been there, it's actually very cold, believe it or not. And the sun doesn't shine very much, and it gets light at like 9 o'clock in the morning. It gets dark at probably 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So bottom line is they have to grow a lot of this stuff in a greenhouse. Okay, well, what happens if your energy costs skyrocket? Well, you can't really run that greenhouse very well. Therefore, you can't produce as many fruits and vegetables. I also want to remind you, the global elite, World Economic Forum, the IMF, the UN, etc., the central planners and authoritarians, as I call them on this channel, they knew about that simple cost-benefit analysis we were talking about earlier, but yet they continued with the sanctions. There's only two reasons why. There's only two possibilities, and I'll let you decide which one is most probable. Either they're just flat out stupid, or they're evil. Well, actually, there's a third. They could be both. Where I land is probably both.
Inflation will decline over the course of 22.
And when we get back to the CNBC article, we can see groups including the National Farmers Unions had previously warned that British farmers were struggling with high energy costs, which is reducing their ability to grow certain fruits and vegetables in heated greenhouses, just like we were saying before. Other Northern European farmers are facing similar issues. But what do the politicians continue to say? We need more sanctions, more sanctions, more sanctions. So if this doesn't prove the fact that they are stupid and or they want to destroy the poor and middle class, I don't know what does. I think the main takeaway from this story is that we as rebel capitalists need to do these common sense cost-benefit analyses on our own. We need to come to our own conclusions. And if what we see in the mainstream media, the talking heads, the global elite, the central planners, the authoritarians, is the complete opposite of what we understand to be just common sense, well, then we need to be very skeptical. We need to ask ourselves, why are they telling us the things they're telling us? Why are they trying to push this narrative? And I think, at least the conclusions that I come to, is that this is just simply propaganda. And it's the Malthusian cult, if you will, trying to guide us in a specific direction in order to achieve their main objectives, which, as you guys know from watching this channel, is simply to reduce population and to reduce energy use. If you look at these sanctions against Russia through the lens of those two objectives, then I think these policies they're trying to push start to make a lot more sense.
And I want to make it very clear. The sanctions are here to stay.
Our second story of the day, straight from Zero Hedge, Brazilian president and World Economic Forum member Lula da Silva pressures population into total COVID vaccination. This is completely insane, absolutely ridiculous. From a standpoint of, just like we were saying in the last story, a simple cost-benefit analysis. The fact that he is pushing this on children is absolutely disgusting. I mean, think about what you are literally doing. You know darn well that the costs outweigh the benefits for the kids getting the medicine, let's say. But you push this on them anyway, knowing full and well that this is going to damage children far more than it benefits them. I mean, if that's not evil, I don't know what is. And this article goes on to accurately point out all of the mistakes that were most likely intentionally made by the authorities going all the way back to 2020. Remember the mask mandates, completely useless. The lockdown mandates, not only were they useless, but they made things far, far worse in terms of distorting the economy and producing the high rates of inflation we see around the world today that is crushing the poor and middle class. Remember, they were talking about how natural immunity just somehow magically doesn't work against this virus. And of course, now that's been completely debunked. And let's remember, going back to 2020, that all of the central planners and the authoritarians were saying that anyone that talked about how COVID might have come from a lab, or maybe it didn't come from a bat market or whatever it is. Oh, that's just a conspiracy theory. Oh, you're a tinfoil hatter. Oh, you've been watching Alex Jones too much. Oh, yeah, okay, right. Now what we see is the U.S. government basically admitting that, oh, yeah, that was probably true, but, oh, nothing to see here. Oh, look, there's a squirrel, which is what their standard operating procedure actually is. But it's not just the lockdowns, it's not just the masks, it's not just the Wuhan that they completely got wrong. It's also the medicines themselves. Remember all the people in the mainstream media telling you that the medicines prevented transmission? Editor, let's cut to the clips.
You're not going to get COVID if you have these vaccinations.
This is one of the encouraging aspects about the efficacy of the vaccine. It'll either protect you completely against infection. If you do get infected, the chances are that you're going to be without symptoms, and the chances are very likely that you'll not be able to transmit it.
And then it comes out that Pfizer themselves admit that they didn't even test the medicines to determine whether or not they prevented transmission.
Did we know about stopping immunization before it's entered the market? No.
And now, of course, we see even in the mainstream media, headline after headline, admitting the fact that these medicines don't prevent transmission at all. So it goes right back to this story where we have to ask the question, why is this psychopath Lula trying to force his entire population to take this, where the cost-benefit analysis, especially for healthy people under the age of 50, makes absolutely no sense. Is he evil? Is he stupid? Or is he both? And before you answer that question, let's dive deeper into the article, because this gets completely insane. So this Lula da Silva says it's all denialism designed to convince the Brazilian populace to remain unprotected from COVID. So any of these facts that we know to be true today, it's all just fake news. It's all just to prevent healthy people in Brazil getting medicated against something that now is pretty much the equivalent of the flu. Let that sink in for a moment. This is what this Brazilian president is running on. This is one of the main focal points of his campaign. And it says right here in the article, Silva has made forced vaccinations a centerpiece of his presidency. Here's a quote from the president. The vaccine is a guarantee of life. Oh, man. We go from the ridiculous to the completely absurd. That's why I took my 5th vaccine today. Wow. 5th. I mean, that's how amazing these medicines actually are. That 2 or 3 years into this, you're already on your 5th. I mean, that in and of itself should give you the information you need to know. But let's keep going. And if there's a 6th, I'll take the 6th. If there's a 7th, I'll take the 7th. I mean, it reminds me of that meme that was going around on Twitter where you had that NPC guy and he had a mask and I think he had like a sheep tail, like right, the sheeple, but he had like 1,000 like needles just injected into his body, just saying, give me another one, give me another one. This Lula guy is basically a real life version of that meme. And what's really amazing is the fact he is launching this in 2023. I mean, if I was reading this story in 2021, it would make a little bit more sense. But now in 2023, again, you have to ask the question, why is he doing it? What is the motivation here? And you go right back to those same 3 conclusions. Either he's stupid or just woefully, blissfully ignorant, intentionally ignorant, or evil, or both. And then we go down to this picture where he's talking to Klaus Schwab, the head of the Malthusian cult, and we know that their objectives: reduce population, reduce energy. And then maybe it starts to make sense.
Everyone who hasn't gotten vaccinated, please get vaccinated. That's how we put this pandemic behind us and accelerate our economic recovery.
Nobody will be safe if not everybody is vaccinated.
And if you don't know the background of Mr. Silva, seems to be quite a character. The World Economic Forum member was convicted on corruption charges in 2018 and was supposed to serve a 12-year prison sentence. However, magically, the article says Brazilian Supreme Court reversed the prison sentence less than 2 years later, based on a coordinated corporate media campaign to kind of spruce up his image a little bit. And then he won the presidential election in 2022. Ever since, Silva has made it his mission to vaccinate all of Brazil, going so far as to restricting welfare benefits for those individuals who refused to get the jabs themselves or to inject a foreign substance into the body of their children. Again, let that sink in for a moment. And here's the real irony. Silva's go-to narrative is to shame Brazilians, it says, into submitting to the medicine by suggesting they are putting their children and relatives at risk. This is straight Orwellian speak. We know darn well today in 2023 that it's the opposite, that the costs far exceed the benefits when it comes to children and the medicine. Then he concludes by having the audacity to say that the medicine is the only guarantee of life. And I have to admit, although this person is morally bankrupt to the point where he would put children of all people at risk, in today's day and age, he's a fantastic politician. He's a great central planner and authoritarian, the perfect type of useful idiot for the Malthusian cult, which is the World Economic Forum. For the last story of the day, let's go right back to macroeconomics and everybody's favorite topic, inflation. Consumer prices going up and up and up. And although we've been in a period of some disinflation, meaning prices are going up at a slower rate, it's still impacting your pocketbook. It's crushing the poor and the middle class. So what should we expect throughout the rest of 2020? I think it's going to be an inflationary decade. But does that mean it's going to look exactly like the 1970s? Not really. Let's go right to a tweet from my good friend Lynn Alden. I'll show you exactly what I'm referring to. This is a fantastic chart that she did based on data from the St. Louis Fed. This blue line represents the fiscal deficit spending as a percentage of GDP. Orange line, new bank loans, percent of GDP. And then gray line, money growth. And she points out immediately in her tweet, a related problem is that most people's mental models for inflation was the 1970s. And I see this all the time on social media and with the talking heads on Bloomberg and CNBC, where when they're talking about inflation, their reference point is always the 1970s, 1970s, 1970s. Why are we not talking about the 1940s? This decade was just as inflationary, but it was inflationary for different reasons. Reasons that I think are more consistent to what we see today and what we will most likely see through the rest of the 2020s. Going back to Lynn's chart, we can see that during the 1940s, as you would expect, government fiscal deficit spending skyrocketed World War II. And then it came back down, and the money supply increased dramatically as well. But the main takeaway here is that the increase in the money supply was a result of government spending. Where in the 1970s, we fast forward, and we can see these orange lines are going much higher than the blue lines, indicating that the increase in money supply during that inflationary decade was most likely a result of the banks increasing the amount of currency units in the economy. So a lot of you may be asking yourself right now, okay, George, why does this even matter? How does this help us predict what may happen throughout the rest of the 2020s? Well, fast forward on this chart to 2020, and we see the blue line going parabolic along with the gray line, but the orange line, bank lending, is pretty much flat. So what this tells us is the increase in the money supply we're seeing today is a result of the federal government deficit spending and the Fed purchasing a lot of those bonds or those treasuries, similar to what we saw in the 1940s. Okay, well, let's think this through. Editor, go ahead and throw up a chart of CPI in the 1940s and the 1970s. In 1947, the CPI got up over 19%. 2 years later, we had 2% deflation. So we go from 19% all the way down to negative 2%, where throughout the 1970s, we had consistent inflation, we had some disinflation, but we didn't actually have deflation. Why? Most likely because the increase in the money supply was from two different sources. So my point is one that Lynn illustrates perfectly with this chart, that if you are to assume that the 2020s is going to be an inflationary decade, you should also assume that the spikes, the peaks and the troughs of inflation will look more like the 1940s and less like the 1970s. So make sure that you are paying attention to government deficit spending, M2 money supply, and the amount of bank lending in the economy if you want to have an edge as far as predicting what the CPI might do throughout the rest of this decade. Or you could simply just follow the Rebel Capitalist channel, because as you guys know, I'm going to be watching this stuff like a hawk. All right, enjoy the rest of your afternoon or day, evening. As always, make sure that you're standing up for freedom, liberty, free market capitalism, and we'll see you in the next video.